Welcome back to episode 173. Today's guest is a returning guest, author David Robson. You can find our first episode with David on episode 136, where we discussed his book, The Expectation Effect. David has three books out on the market: The Expectation Effect, his first book, The Intelligence Trap, and now releasing this week is his new book, The Laws of Connection: The Scientific Secrets to Building a Strong Social Network. David has quickly become one of my all time favorite authors, not just because he is a great science researcher and writer, but because David takes the information that he learns throughout his research and starts to apply it to his life. And so in the book, you will find multiple studies, both longitudinal and otherwise, that break down the laws of connection, the scientific secrets of building your strong social network. And I think this is something that's extremely important, especially in this day and age. We have lost true connection with each other. In this episode, we discuss the challenges that come with making connections, especially in our adult life, because the soil may not be as fertile as when we're young and we're packed into a class with 30, 40, 50 people in our elementary, junior high, high school, or even college courses. David's research was extremely impactful in this book on me in several ways, and we discuss some of the impact points that it hit for me and him as well. So, without further ado, I want to reintroduce you to David Robson and the Laws of Connection. Welcome to The Evolved Man, where we are at war with the mediocrity of modern man. The Evolved Man is for men like you who are willing to be strong, open, and aggressive learners. Men who are not afraid to disrupt and change. It's time we ditch the current conventional idea that we devolve with age, that the dad bod is our destiny, and that the glory days are behind us. Your best isn't behind you, and I'm here to provide you with practical tools, a few tips and tricks, and everyday wisdom to help you evolve into your highest form. Strong, lean, smart, educated, and emotionally intelligent. Now, let's go to war. Well, David, thank you for coming back. As you know, I'm a big fan of your writing. And for our listeners who have not heard our previous conversation about your book, The Expectation Effect, they can find that episode on 136. I'm curious, David, from studying why smart people do dumb things to the power of expectations in our lives, to this new topic of human connection. How do you decide what to write about?
I mean, I guess like in science, there's this kind of like saying, especially in psychology, that research is me search. And I guess
I like that. Yep.
like for each of these topics, they're like kind of quite personal. This is the most personal yet. You know, I've been very shy as a teenager and in my 20s. Working as a journalist actually helped me to become more socially confident. But
Mm.
it always been kind of in the back of my mind, like what does it mean to have like real, true social connection? Like how can we make that process easier? Like it's very common for people to feel lonely. Around 50% of people report feeling lonely fairly regularly in their lives. Some people have extreme loneliness. For other people, it's probably just occasional periods, but it still can feel very unpleasant. And most people want, even complete extroverts kind of do feel that they want closer connections to certain people. So I was super fascinated by kind of how what psychology could tell us about how to ease that process, how to build that connection that we all crave.
I think you do a great job in your book of explaining and breaking down not only the different mechanisms, but helping to create a connection with the reader that this is everybody experiences this at least some point in life, this lack of connection. And I think that as social media and the digital presence that we have with other people has made this difficult for us to connect, right? Maybe even more difficult, I think, than when I was a kid, because it's not as easy as just, going and knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, you want to go play basketball or whatever," like we did when when we were kids. So I think you do a great job of walking readers through with both a scientific basis, but also this sense of empathy that, hey, we're in this together, and we can. These are not these skills are things that can be developed. Um, as I mentioned earlier, I think on our previous podcast, one of the things that I really enjoy about your writings is you write about things from a scientific perspective. You write about things from a reporter's perspective, but you also do a really nice job of peppering in your own personal experience. So I'm curious, just right off the bat, what was the biggest takeaway from your book for you?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I kind of really try to apply everything I learn and everything I write, especially in my books, to my own life. So it's kind of tried, it comes from, robust scientific research, but then I kind of road test it myself to check that it's practical. So there's so much for me to choose from. But I think like the kind of one thing that I really took away and I would just love to spread to kind of everyone I meet is just this basic idea that we're often overly pessimistic about our capacity to connect. And you see this time and time again. It's a really common cognitive bias that we have. And so many of our interactions that we just underestimate other people's willingness to bridge the divide between us, if only we give them the opportunity to do so. And so, like, all of the book is looking at this from different angles and explaining how we can encourage those opportunities and make more of them. But that is the take-home message: is that actually often the connection that we crave is like right at our fingertips. It's like often like sitting across the table from us, and we just don't take the opportunity.
Yeah, I've got to be honest, I really resonated when you talked about that we often underestimate how others how much others like us. I mean, that's something that I walk away and I'm like, yeah, the person probably didn't like me. It just kind of
Mm,
is what it is. And so that was pretty fascinating for me. One thing that I'm curious about, as we get older, there seems to be this almost guilt and shame that we are looking for friends when we're older, right? It seems like it's more natural, or that, by the time we reach a certain age, that we should already have friends and connections. And that's not always the case. So, how does building connection later in life differ, if it does, from when we're adolescents?
mm. I mean, so social connection is essential at all ages. And so that was one of the inspirations of my book, was all of this research showing that social connection can be incredibly healing for the physical body. It sounds kind of woo-woo, but it's not. It's all based on really robust evidence from hundreds of studies that people who have a strong sense of connection with the people around them tend to, live longer. They're protected from all kinds of diseases, including those of aging, like cardiovascular disease or Alzheimer's. So, creating connection is especially important when we're in kind of middle age or later in life. But I think you're right. We carry this kind of shame around, thinking that, if we haven't got like a fixed social network, by 40 or 50 or 60, then it's kind of too late to build that. And I think this shame is it's unproductive and unnecessary, like most kinds of shame are actually, because it's absolutely natural that as we move through life, people move away. We move, further apart from people who even live close to us, like emotionally speaking, like we might just find that our interests have diverged. We have inevitable kind of fallings out with the people around us, and sometimes it's hard to kind of heal those fractures in our relationships. So social connection isn't something that you can just kind of fix at one point in time and guarantee that it will last for the rest of our lives. It's a very um, fluid thing. In much the same way that, like if you work out all the time, you can't just stop at 50 and assume that you're going to stay in shape for the rest
There
of
you
your
go.
life. Yeah. So it is, we definitely we lose our confidence as we get older, I think, in our ability to build new friendships. And I think partly that's because we're just not presented with so many ready-made opportunities that we might have had when we were younger.
Right.
At kind of school, at college, university, in your first jobs, you're kind of thrown together with new people who are all in a very similar stage in their life. And it's natural that you're going to start building friendships with them. Everyone's got kind of more free time at that point, fewer family responsibilities. I'm not saying it's easy because I don't think it is easy even at that age because we carry these kind of psychological barriers, but there are more obvious overt opportunities and the context just feels right. Whereas later in life, maybe, you don't find so many people who are in exactly the same position. And so you start to feel a lot shyer, a lot more. We're kind of lost for ideas of how to connect, and that's what I think I wanted to show in my book is that there are always opportunities, no matter kind of what stage of life you're at. There are always opportunities to find new people who quite quickly can become very important in your life.
Yeah, it seems like we have to have a more surgical approach to it, right? It got me thinking as I've been reading your book and preparing for this conversation. Yesterday my son graduated from high school, and the graduating class was close to 600 people. And so when you think about what fertile soil that is for making social connections, I mean, you've got just in your class close to 600 people that you could throw a stick at and probably hit one and become a friend with. Whereas I can't remember the last time that I was in any type of entity or organization where there were 600 people to choose from to say, I'm going to go develop this friendship. So I think that's one of the
Right.
things that was pretty powerful for me in the book is just saying this perspective that as we age, our skills need to improve. And we also need to look for opportunities to create this connection. I also want to go back to what you were discussing before about the power of relationships related to health. For our listeners, can you explain what the Almada 8 is and why you disagree with C.S. Lewis's statement that friendship is unnecessary, it has no survival value, rather, it is one of those things that gives value to survival?
Right. I mean, I agree with C.S. Lewis in that I do think that social connection gives value to survival. What I disagree with is the fact that it's not essential for survival,
Mm-hmm.
because it really is. Like he was totally wrong in that regard.
Right.
And that comes from like just an understanding of human evolution. Like quite early on in our kind of evolution from other primates, like in the human line, we started living in bigger and bigger groups. And we started pooling resources and relying on others for our protection from predators, from kind of emergency weather events, from starvation. We started looking after each other when we were kind of sick or ill or injured, and this allowed all kinds of new traits to emerge in the human line, one of which is our amazingly big brains compared to other primates, which just wouldn't have been possible if we were all living solitary lives and only kind of coupled up to mate. Now, as a function of this, we actually started evolving um, kind of like an early warning system for when our social connections were threatened, and that is the painful feeling of social exclusion, that kind of
Mm.
social pain that I think is familiar to all of us. Whether you've been through a relationship breakup or you've lost your best friend, or you're facing a family estrangement. It feels like physical pain, and there's actually overlap in the brain areas that deal with both kinds of pain because it's telling us, the same way that physical pain teaches us that our body is injured and we need to find some way to rest and heal. The social pain is telling us that we need to maintain those connections. We have to tend to them if they're under threat. And at the same time, because we were relying so much on other people to protect us from predators, when we feel socially excluded, you actually start having a physiological reaction that will help you to deal with all of these new threats that you're going to face when you're excluded. So you're more likely to be injured or wounded and to get a bacterial infection in one of those wounds if you're isolated compared to if you have your group to defend you. So our bodies adapt to that to kind of preempt those potential injuries with things like increased inflammation, which will help to be a first line of defense against those bacteria that might infect our wound, and kind of it increases blood clotting agents, which will help the wound to heal and reduce the risk of serious blood loss. So that's happening in our body every time we feel lonely. And if it happens just kind of periodically for very short amounts of time, that's not so dangerous for you. Like that's why it evolved, because it was good for our short-term survival. But if you're feeling lonely day after day after day and you're lacking social connection, so you're ramping up the inflammation, you're ramping up the blood clotting factors, well, that puts you at risk of all kinds of diseases, that kind of chronic exposure, which is why it's linked to things like cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease, which in both cases, we know that like inflammation is a major risk factor. Um,
Right.
Now, the connection, I think, between social connection and health is so solid now because we've got so many multiple lines of evidence all pointing in this direction. So we've got longitudinal studies that show that when people feel socially connected, they're less likely to develop those diseases. So epidemiological evidence. We've got animal studies of other social animals who have similar physiological reactions to us. We have laboratory studies showing the kind of short-term effects of social exclusion or loneliness in the brain and in the body. They all point in the same direction. And when you kind of analyze that huge body of research, you can see that social connection is as important as these other lifestyle factors that were evident from the 1960s in a famous longitudinal study
Mm.
in Alameda, which is where the Alameda 8 come from. So you had all of these other lifestyle factors, such as, that we now know are just so important, like um, diet, how much you weigh relative to your height, whether you have kind of do exercise and have good physical activity, whether you sleep well, whether you eat breakfast, um, whether you take your medications. All of those are important, but so is social connection of equal or greater importance than all of those. So in this Alameda study, social connection was like the eighth factor that was discovered, and it turned out to be, easily up there with the most important.
It's amazing the power that the brain has, right? I mean, our brain is connected through the different regions. When you think about the limbic portion of the brain, where we experience most of our emotions, the brain is the head of the central nervous system, which is the controls the peripheral nervous system, and it sends signals to every system within the body that allows us to heal, that allows us to recover, that allows us to do everything in life. And I think back to when I was younger, growing up, in the 80s and 90s, and it was often said that some of this stuff is just quote in your head, right?
Mm.
And that might be true, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't change how we respond. And that's not a bad thing, because connection improves the way we feel via several pathways in the brain and in the hormonal systems and the endocrine system. Like they're all connected. And so this was fascinating to me. I thought it was really interesting to see also how it overlapped with your work in the expectation effect, that what we expect we will then move towards. You talk about in your book that people tend to find connection through some sameness. You and I think alike, we believe alike, or maybe we look alike, and so we must be friends, right? How does the shared reality help us to create connection with others?
Yeah. So, I mean, like you say, basic similarities are important. Like if someone has a similar background to you, grow up in the same region, speaking the same kind of dialect, the same accent, those things do help to, they're like the kind of seeds of connection. But they're not the be all and end all, far from it. And actually, what really matters is a kind of more intimate similarity in the way that you're thinking and feeling. We call that this shared reality. It's just recognizing that the other person is seeing the world and experiencing the world in the same way that you are, right down to, the fluctuations in your emotions or the particular interpretation you put on, tiny events. So there's a huge amount of psychological research on this, showing that just, small cues like whether you laugh at the same joke, respond emotionally in the same way to a piece of art or music, whether you start finishing each other's sentences
Mhm.
or kind of interrupt each other with when you're, thinking the same thoughts. All of those are cues that you've kind of built this shared reality. And the more of those cues you experience, like the more you feel that in your everyday life, the closer you feel to someone. And those small intimate cues can be more important than some of the kind of big issues that you're facing. So your political beliefs, do matter. Like a Republican is more likely to be friends with Republicans than a Democrat. But a Democrat is more likely to be friends with a Republican if they also, do have that sense of shared reality by having the same interpretation of, say, an emotional event, a joke, a sunset, whatever. If they have that intimacy in their thoughts and feelings, that kind of overrides the kind of broader political worldview that they have. Which I think is very powerful and kind of it makes me very optimistic. But what I really love about this research is that you can move from these kind of psychological questionnaires and experiments, and you can actually look at people's brain activity.
Mhm.
So
This
you
was
can put
fascinating.
them
Yeah.
yeah, so you can kind of get them to view like a load of clips on YouTube of, like a comedy routine, music video, documentary, just loads of different stuff. And you see that if people share similar brain activity to the same events in those clips, so the same regions are lighting up at the same time, um, from that you can predict who's going to be better friends with who. And I see that we call it interbrain coupling. I
Mhm.
see that as being the kind of neural substrate of a shared reality. It kind of is what's helping these people to connect is the fact that their brains are kind of on the same wavelength, almost literally.
Isn't it funny how none of that really? I mean, if we strip away the titles of you're Republican, you're Democrat, like we strip all of that away and we just look at what that shared reality is, it doesn't really matter what we classify ourselves as or identify as. We can all experience that same, shared reality. Like I think of some of my best friends. We come from very different backgrounds. We may have different political views. We may have, you could stand us side by side and look and say, wow, you guys are totally opposite. And yet we share so much of that shared reality because of some of the interests that we have, or we get hit in the same way with humor, or we are stimulated and fascinated by the same art or books or whatever it is. And I find it fascinating. I think you referenced this a little bit in the book where talking about the political climate and Republicans and Democrats, they tended to want to think of the other person as smarter if they identified as the same as them, same political party.
Mhm.
But we strip all of that away and it doesn't matter, right? We can still share the same connection because it's not about a title or a name, is it?
No, exactly. And, I think like polarization kind of occurs when we forget that we might have a shared reality on so many other areas of life, that
Right.
the political viewpoints are like an important part, but they're only one part of our kind of consciousness, and actually we might be able to connect on so many other areas. And once we recognize that shared reality, that we are still interpreting the world in the same way on a kind of moment by moment level, then we might also find it easier to discuss those political views, and we might be, because we can be more constructive, we can find that actually maybe there are still points of agreement that we can then build on, and that just by understanding the other person's point of view, and kind of really recognizing that they're coming from maybe different values to your own, but values that are still valid. I think that can contribute to so much more constructive discussions.
Well, it allows us to come together in a way that the narrative is not the thing driving us, and it's more about where are those similarities. I had a friend at one point that really shocked me, opened my eyes. It was not something that I was aware of, but he had made a comment to me. He said, you are my only straight friend that doesn't treat me like like a gay guy." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "I don't understand that." He says, "You see me for me." And he says, "My sexuality is one aspect of who I am. You see me for all of me." And he says, "I have many friends that are in the LGBTQ plus community that treat me that way." He says, "You are my only straight friend that treats me like that." I said, "That's sad. That is
Mm.
extremely sad." Because he says, "Yeah, but I've only been identified as one thing for people who are maybe not part of this community." And anyway, it just shocked me, and it helped me to open up my eyes to say, how much of life are we, we just going along with some sort of narrative, right? Versus seeing the other person for the totality of who they are and being open and aware of all of the beauty that each one of us has, and trying to find those connections. And it seems like through your book, you really discuss this idea of that we have to search for those connections, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I can totally identify with what you say. I'd say in general, so I'm a gay guy, and I would say in
Mhm.
general, like I'm lucky to have like loads of straight friends who I think do treat me as a kind of whole-rounded being. But yeah, there have been
That's
some
great.
people who haven't, and it's very odd. Like it should not be. It's the least interesting thing about me. It should not be
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
defines how someone views me. But I think maybe society is getting a lot better at this now. But yeah, it's a problem. And I think, like you say, like my book is really telling people to just look harder rather than kind of, just like looking at people on such a surface level.
Yeah.
Now, one of the kind of big pieces of advice in kind of the self-help literature on building social connection has always been put yourself in someone else's shoes. Like try to think, try to imagine what they would be thinking and
Yeah.
feeling.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree that that can be useful, but I think, as you pointed out, like lots of people maybe just rely on like stereotypes. Like they look at these surface level features of someone's identity and then they think they know that person. And so often they make like really mistaken assumptions, and it can break that sense of shared reality when people are operating on assumptions about who you are and what you think rather than actually asking you what you think and bothering to learn. You know, your shared reality crumbles. And so that's why asking questions of people, even people you think you know really well, is so important. So there have been studies showing that, even married couples who've been together for, decades, they still often have these false assumptions about, what their partner is thinking and feeling. And it's rather than trying to imagine or second guess, it's better just to ask because everyone has the capacity to surprise. No matter how long you've known someone, you might find that their thinking is more nuanced, or takes a different turn than you had imagined. And that's one of the pleasures of having these long-term relationships, is actually being constantly surprised by the other person.
I wonder how that applies to our own personal life. I think that we tend to tell ourselves a story, maybe even just based on our own personal history. I am this way, and I am, and so then, like with other people, we're making assumptions about ourselves based on our past, and that may block our ability to move forward. I thought this concept, David, was really fascinating in the book. You talk about the personality myth. And you mentioned in the book, and I know we referenced it earlier, that we often underestimate how much people like us. And like I said, I have to admit, I'm often taken back when I receive positive feedback from somebody because I constantly underestimate my likability. Um, Given that this is a prevalent problem, What would you recommend to people? Like, what works to reduce this redundant thought?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's that's so important. It's so that phenomenon is called the liking gap, and um, what I find interesting is like, so you have this liking gap, you underestimate how much the other person likes you, even if you really like them. Um, that happens the first time you meet someone, but actually, studies of students found that, when they were living together in kind of group accommodation, they would still experience this liking gap for about 7 or more months after
Mhm.
they had first met. So it kind of
Mhm.
lingers. And I think that actually takes us back to what you were saying. What's the difference between kind of making friends when you're older compared to when you're younger? Well, actually, those students, had that time together where they were, living, on campus. They had that time where they could get over the liking gap and eventually realize that the other person liked them just as much as they liked the other person, and they could build that kind of new friendship from that. And it took time for them to overcome those assumptions. But like older, when you're older, later in life, you're not thrown together in the same way. So the liking gap can just be a big barrier to connection because if you have a great conversation with someone, you feel there was that rapport, but then you start second guessing it. That just dissuades you from kind of asking to meet up again, like exchanging phone numbers, asking for a collaboration at work. And so we just kind of go our separate ways and we don't build on what could have been a really great friendship. So overcoming the liking gap is really essential, especially as we get older, but even I would argue for those students, because it would just accelerate the formation of those friendships. Now the research suggests that just kind of being aware of this, I think can help. But what you really need to do is kind of to practice making friends as well. So it's not something that we necessarily do as much as we could do. Just talking to strangers, we might avoid it where we can. So you're only doing it every few weeks or months, and then you kind of, even if you have a positive experience, which the statistics suggest you are overwhelmingly likely to have a positive experience of talking to a stranger, like you're both likely to enjoy that conversation. You kind of forget that the next time you do it because enough time has passed. So you need to be really proactive in looking for opportunities to practice your social skills and to remind yourself of the fact that your expectations are overly negative and to then recalibrate those expectations. And it can be done and it can be done quickly. So studies suggest that even after just say five 5 days to a week of deliberately approaching strangers to kind of just make conversation, um, that is enough to already have a meaningful impact on your expectations and on these beliefs. So you feel more socially confident, you trust more that other people are gonna like you and that you're gonna find those conversations enjoyable and that you have that competence to do it successfully. That's my big piece of advice, really, from that part of the book is actually just whether you think you're introvert, extrovert, shy, confident, just putting this into practice, deliberately looking for those opportunities can have a rapid effect.
I thought that was a fascinating piece to the book when you discussed that more often than not, we leave those initial interactions and we are so satisfied and it's far more enjoyable than what we initially thought. There's some fear and apprehension in meeting other people and getting to talk about it, but most people report that the satisfaction level is so much higher once we do that.
Yeah.
And I think it's great advice. The more often we meet people and we do that, we improve our skills. What's your recommendation? I mean, if somebody's listening to this and they say, "Yeah, that sounds great, David, but I don't get out in social situations, and so where can I go? How can I meet people without, being the weird guy that just walks up to somebody in the coffee shop?" Or like, how do people get started? How do they overcome
Yeah.
those fears? What would you recommend?
Yeah. I mean, like I think like kind of taking up new hobbies and interests, going to like
Mm.
an evening class or, taking up a sport, all of these things can definitely help. So I think it's quite nice often, like it definitely helps our confidence if there is a context in which it's kind of to be expected that you're going to make small talk. So if you have this kind of, new club or whatever that you're a member of, it feels a bit more natural.
It's a
But
little
having
more
said
like the
that, in
shared
these,
reality piece, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, like you
Mm.
already have something to talk about. But having said that, in these studies of people talking to strangers, they literally were just like talking to like a fellow commuter on a train
Mm.
or someone next to them in the coffee shop, or they just approached someone in the park with like a cute dog and were like, just started talking about asking the dog's name, breed, all of that. So like, and that worked really well. Like that, it was in those situations where the people were really reporting like having enjoyable conversations and very satisfying experiences. So it is possible. You just have to kind of overcome those initial nerves. It really helps to have like what we call in psychology implementation intentions. And so rather than just having
Mm.
the vague
Mhm.
kind of idea, oh yeah, I should be more sociable, you pick out specific instances where you're going to enact this. So if I see someone struggling with their shopping at the supermarket, I'll offer to help them to carry their groceries. Or, next time I'm in a coffee shop, I'll just strike up a conversation with the person next to me. So just identifying the situation and how you're going to go about that just makes the behavioral change so much more likely.
Those are great suggestions, and I love that yours is focused in just a simple interaction, whether you're at the coffee shop or whether it's helping and serving another person. We do crave these. I mean, I bought some new shoes recently that I wore to the gym, and I can't even count the number of people that came up to me and told me that they liked my shoes, and we just started conversation. I felt so great. I wore those shoes every day for the next week. And then when people stopped talking to me, I was online looking for other shoes that I could wear where people would come up to me and just,
Yeah.
introduce themselves. Because I met several people by just wearing a pair of shoes. And it, it caused me to pause and think, wow, we really do crave this. I know I crave that. But I also enjoy it when I initiate that conversation. I'm curious, I think many people have heard of the illusion of understanding, but I think you in your book you talk about the illusion of transparency, which I thought was fascinating. Can you talk about the illusion of transparency and what uh, that illusion causes?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess like the researchers seem to have been inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Telltale Heart, which I
Mm.
kind of love. And it's like the protagonist in that because he knows his guilt at this murder, he assumes that the other people around him are reading all of these signals from him and that they can hear the beating heart that he can hear, when actually it's his own heart that he's hearing like bumping in his ears. But that is a very, very typical pattern of behavior that we just assume that our emotions or our intentions are just so obvious to other people that they're going to pick up on them really easily without us explicitly saying what we're feeling or what we mean. So they've scientists, tested this in all kinds of ingenious experiments. They kind of tested it with people who were told to kind of tell lies to other members of their group, and they just assumed that they would be detected straight away because they felt guilty. So they thought they had all of these kind of psychological, tells in their body language that other people would pick up on, but no one could tell whether they were
Mhm.
lying or telling the truth. They tried it when people were told to kind of mask their feelings about food that they were eating. So they had like some like foul tasting, like brine water from I think it's from like preserved olive leaves or something. And they had to pretend that they were enjoying like a really pleasant drink of like like a cherry flavored Kool-Aid. And again, they thought that their disgust was like written all over their face, that people would easily be able to tell like what they were drinking and whether they liked it or not. But no one could guess any better than chance. It was just their feelings just weren't visible. they did another experiment, where they were kind of taking this test in a class, and there was like cheating going on, and they each person didn't say anything, but they assumed that their disapproval and outrage would be obvious to all of the classmates. Again, it wasn't. So the whole class kind of allowed this kind of cheating to continue because they all thought that they were making enough of a stand by not saying anything, but just by kind of giving disapproving looks, but just no one noticed that they were doing that. So that's the illusion of transparency. You can see it then also in the words that we say. We kind of just assume that people understand kind of our intention when often we're kind of surprisingly vague in what we're saying. And it's a real problem for connection because, if you think like in a positive scenario, like your kind of joy at seeing another person, you might just think that it's so obvious you don't have to actually tell that person that you're really enjoying their company, but they
Right.
don't know that. And so I
Yeah.
think that contributes actually to the liking gap that we spoke about, because each person is assuming the other person knows how much they like them, but they don't. They're not focusing on the same cues at all. Conversely, I think it can we can feel more isolated and lonely when people aren't noticing what we're feeling if we're kind of stressed or unhappy, because we assume that other person knows and just doesn't care. But often they will they have no reason to believe that anything's wrong in your life unless you actually speak up and say. So what the illusion of transparency really tells me is just that we have to be more vocal in our interactions. We have to actually put our feelings into words often. Like, we can't just rely on other people to be able to read what we're feeling. And conversely, we can't rely on our own abilities to tell what other people are feeling, which is why, again, we have to actually check in with people and ask the question.
I think it's fascinating for everyone, but I especially resonated with it because I got diagnosed with ADHD later in life, and looking back, I think, wow, that makes a lot of sense, right? But one of the things that I have learned as I have looked historically at my life, but also read the research about ADHD, is that people with neurodivergent brains, they tend to uh, assume more because of the intensity of the emotions that other people can just read. And so it's like what you're talking about, of the illusion of transparency, almost gets blown up 10 times, right? And so I lived in that space many times in life, thinking, well, how do you not know what I'm thinking? And I hadn't accurately communicated what my thoughts or what my feelings were. And so that was very, very powerful to read how broad that gap is. Fascinating. I'm curious, how does stress affect egocentric thinking?
Yeah, so I mean, it's sadly kind of ironic that when we might most need to be able to take other people's perspectives, we're less able to.
Mm,
So stress, feeling under pressure, these things can make you more egocentric. And the reason for that is it's actually cognitively pretty difficult to be considering other people's points of view, to be working out, what they can, what they already know, what they don't know, what they can see, what they can't see. And so anything that's kind of taxing the brain and reducing our overall cognitive resources is taking those resources away from our theory of mind, which we need to overcome our egocentric thinking. So when you're feeling stressed, that's when you're maybe less capable of taking on board what other people might be thinking. But even if we're totally chilled, even if I think like neurotypical people just generally vastly overestimate the accuracy and reliability of their theory of mind. And it's
mm.
just not, you know, just because you have the ability does not mean that you're using it regularly.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, what are some of the mental mistakes that we make when we're stressed?
I mean, I think, there's loads of them that are all kind of egocentric. So like the illusion of understanding that you mentioned earlier would be one of them. And, that is just when we kind of think that other people can kind of read what we're saying, even when it's very ambiguous. And I mean, or even when there's no reason at all to believe that they would be able to. Like there was a great study from the University of Chicago that looked at uh, native Mandarin speakers from China and native English speakers from the US, neither of whom could speak each other's languages, and they just got them to kind of read out sentences. And they asked, like, how likely is it that the other person is going to understand what you say? Like, it was multiple choice questions, and they're like, how likely is it that the other person is going to pick the right answer? And both sides kind of imagined that people would understand what they were saying better than
Mm.
chance,
Mm.
even though they're unrelated languages, and there's no reason to believe that you could understand like completely different vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation. It's just baffling to me, but I think like, I've seen enough people on holiday who will talk to someone in another language, like very slowly and loudly, as
Yes.
if that alone is enough. And like, I'm not, it is possible often to
Mhm.
communicate with, say, a minimum vocabulary, with pantomime, with gesture, with
Right,
all of
right.
that. But this was, lacking all of those other potential cues. So yeah, I think that's one of these things that in a high pressure moment, we're less, we really think that what we're saying is kind of totally obvious. Um, that's only going to cause more confusion down the line if we don't recognize that actually there is some kind of communication barrier here.
So when you don't understand each other, speak slower and louder.
Right, yeah, that's
Good,
the
good.
answer. Yeah.
um, my kids and I talk about this all the time. That it seems to be that we are living in a society where the art of conversation is either dead or it's on its deathbed, just on life support. Uh, we we're not leaning into the art of conversation as much as I would like us to be. I'd like you to talk about the sins of attention because this is clearly something that is breaking down the art of conversation. What are some of the sins of inattention?
Yeah. Like it should be obvious that like if you're talking to someone you um like the kind of minimum courtesy you can pay to them is to actually to make sure that you're focusing on what they're saying. But sadly, like you say, it's not as common as it should be.
Mm-hmm.
When I was writing that chapter, like I literally just started it, met up with someone, a kind of colleague for a drink, and his eyes were just wandering everywhere in the conversation, like he was not listening to what I was saying at
Yeah.
all. And I thought, why did you arrange this if you like don't you're not going to even listen to what I'm saying? But yeah, it's common. Um, that's quite an extreme case, but I think often we are paying attention, but we're just not showing it in the right ways. So I found this quite illuminating that you can show your attention to people in lots of different ways. Like you could like just nod your head, with good body language, like lean forward. You can use these what are called paralinguistic cues. So that is like murmuring. They're not words exactly, but you're like, yeah, you know, kind of interjecting at the right moments.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can be really explicit, like you can say like, oh yeah, I really agree with what you've said. You might reiterate, paraphrase what they've just said. You might give your own experience or an observation. You might ask a follow-up question. Um, Now, the research suggests that we rely just too much on those body language and paralinguistic cues. And again, it's egocentric thinking. It's like we know that we are paying attention, and we assume that then with just those little cues that the other person is going to know that we care about what they're saying, that we're curious. But they don't, because we could easily fake that. Like I think we've all known conversations where people are kind of you know, they couldn't repeat what you've said at all, but they've just kind of paid lip service to it by kind of nodding or,
Yeah,
or kind
acting.
of murmuring yes.
Right.
Yeah, it's acting, everyone does it a little bit, but that breaks down the shared reality because when you start having these doubts, like were they actually paying attention or were they acting? Like you just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you use those explicit linguistic cues, like if you actually do ask that follow-up question, that shows that you were paying attention and it shows that what they were saying was really meaningful to you. Um, and sure enough, then that is the kind of thing that fosters greater connection. Technology, you know, is a bad one for making us, is another sin of attention, is phone snubbing or phubbing, they call it, or
Yep.
also the iPhone effect. People have got their phones on the table, they're like, you're talking, they're constantly like pressing refresh or like checking their notifications. That again erodes the shared reality. So my advice would really be put your phone in your bag, kind of make eye contact, um, use those paralinguistic cues if you have to, but also then um, paraphrase what people are saying and ask those follow-up questions. Like that's really what shows that you're engaged and that you really care about forming that mutual understanding.
I can't remember what the stat is. I'm curious, and you probably know, but there was something that I read sometime back that said that if you have your phone on the table when you're at a meal together, that there's a certain percentage likelihood that you are less engaged, even just by having it on the table turned
Yeah,
over versus putting it in a bag, having it out of sight, out of mind. I can't recall what that is, but anyway.
yeah. No, yeah, definitely I've come across that study. I can't remember the exact figure, but yeah, it definitely does reduce the quality of the communication. And sometimes I think, like again, like these good general rules to follow, but sometimes it might not be possible. Like, your
Sure.
wife might be pregnant and you're like waiting for a call to
Right,
say she's
right,
gone into labor. Like,
right.
that is totally acceptable. You might be waiting for like a really important work email that, means that you're gonna get promotion or, be made redundant. Again, it's absolutely understandable that your attention is going to be distracted. But again, we need to be explicit about that. I think people will be
Communicate. Yeah.
so understanding if you just say, like if you just ask, like, can I have my phone on the table because I'm expecting this important call. What that does is just reduces the self-doubt of the other person. It means that they don't have to worry that they are being boring or that you don't care about what they're saying, because you've got a good reason there.
Yeah, you're setting an expectation. I think that's appropriate.
Right.
I'm curious to get your thought on this because your story about going out with your colleague really made me it flashed back to something that I can completely relate to. Several years ago, I was working for a company, and there was about I don't know, half a dozen of us or so that went out to dinner together, and we had been invited by the bosses to go out to dinner. We get there, and we're having what I thought was a very engaging conversation. And because I'm a big fan of conversation and connection, I don't, as a general rule, I don't have my phone on the table. At some point in the conversation, one by one, each one of the heads goes down. One person grabs their phone and starts to do this thing where they're looking down
Mm,
under the table. And then
yeah.
another person brings it above the table and starts to. And so the conversation just immediately, within probably 5 to 10 seconds, died. And I sat there staring at my colleagues and my bosses and thought, wow, this is fascinating. And I just sat back as a social experiment to see how long is this going to last? Because we
Yeah.
were in the middle of a conversation and one by one, everybody picked off. And I just sat there looking and smiling. And then I thought to myself, how long do I want to sit here with people that are doing this? And is
Mm,
this worth
yeah.
my time? And so at a certain point, and I can't remember how long it was, I just said, well, thank you all for a lovely dinner and great conversation. I'm going to head out and go see my wife and kids.
Yeah.
And one person looked up and said, oh my gosh, look at us. We're all on our phones. Oh, we're all so busy.
Yeah.
And I excused myself and I left. And that's like indelibly in my brain. I don't know if I handled it the right way or not. I don't know if
Yeah.
how I felt about it at the time, other than I thought it was curious. I thought it was rude. I mean, there's many different ways that I think I probably felt or thought about it, but I'm not sure that I really identified that too much. I'm curious though, if you were in that situation, knowing what you know about connection, how would you handle that?
Yeah, interesting. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think it's a totally reasonable response is to just, you know, if a conversation isn't kind of going the way that you want, is to just kind of leave it. You can
Mhm.
reconnect with those people another time.
Sure. Yeah.
like, but there's no, if you feel that you're kind of not getting enough out of the conversation, yeah, I think like just kind of cutting it short is like politely, is
Mhm.
the right thing to do. I mean, I think I probably would have kind of stuck around, but it would depend how long it went on for. I mean, I do think like it's perfectly possible that once people have, you know, it's a difficult, like it's like a kind of black hole. The once people are like on their phones, they
Yeah.
really struggle to
Yeah.
pull themselves away again. And that's when, yeah, I think you're totally right. You should leave. It's a tough one. I mean, I think, it is fair also to just say, like, guys, can we actually talk? Like we haven't seen each other for ages.
Yeah.
But that can have like it can generate a little bit of friction, and sometimes it's just not worth that.
Yeah, I question it at times. Did I
Yeah,
handle it right? And not that it was a big deal in my life, right? But for some
yeah,
reason, that has stuck with me as a question of, okay, if it happens again, what do I do, right?
yeah,
Um, for our listeners who are not aware of I don't know if I'm saying this right, Hazlitt's law or Hazlitt's law,
yeah. Hazlitt's law.
Hazlitt's
Yeah.
law. What is that?
Yeah, so he was this writer in the early kind of 1700s, and he spoke about one of his acquaintances, a painter, who just like in conversation, he just made everyone feel amazing. And it was partly because he was a very interesting guy himself who had lots of cool insights. But the important thing was that he also just asked a lot of questions. And the Hazlitt's law then is this maxim that the art of conversation is as much about hearing as it is about being heard. Um, that's something that we can forget. I think sadly it's one of the things that when you feel quite shy and you really want to impress people, you can kind of talk too much, and that can be off-putting for the other person. So just knowing kind of to ask questions is quite fundamental in itself. I do think kind of that, the general idea of asking questions is well known, but the research suggests we're still not doing enough of it. And also, we're not asking the right kinds of questions. And it's all about kind of trying to build up the shared reality with the questions you're asking. So they do have to be the right kind. A really superficial kind of ice-breaking question like, "Hey, how are you?" You know, unless the other person kind of gives you like an in-depth response, it's not really helping to show a lot of interest in their life or to understand like where they're coming from. Similarly, some of us have like this really bad habit of boomer asking. So boomer asking is like a boomerang where it's going to come back around to you. And so you just ask a question just because you want immediately to turn the spotlight back on something that you want to talk about. So
Mm,
you say like, hey, how's work going? As soon as they've answered, you're like, well, I had a promotion. And then it's like you've kind of paid lip service to the idea of like
yeah,
asking
yeah.
questions and caring about the other person but it's meaningless. The ones that really are flattering is the follow-up questions. So it's not just those initial questions, like when you're first getting to know someone, but it's then like probing deeper, always kind of probing deeper. So things like, if someone tells you like what profession they do, it's like asking like, why did you choose that? Or kind of what do you love about your profession? Or what's the most stressful thing about this? Or just showing that you really want to understand like uh their experience, not just the facts, but their personal experience. That's what we really need to do with our questions. And that I think is what Hazlitt's law is getting at. It's showing that you want to hear what people have to say.
And you talk about in the book that those questions can be very flattering because it helps the other person to know that you see them, right?
Mm.
You also talked about that flattery and giving positive feedback can be one of the best ways of creating connection. But there's a risk to it. Can you talk about the risks of the positive feedback and how do we overcome those?
Yeah, I mean, so generally we just don't give kind of positive feedback or pay compliments, show appreciation enough. again, it's this kind of needless pessimism that we think we're kind of too clumsy, or too, uh, or we think the other person kind of knows that they're great and they don't need to hear it. One danger of kind of paying compliments and giving praises that we think we're going to seem kind of unctuous, and that the flattery is going to be perceived as being manipulative. But actually, again, there's not much, when you look at people's actual perceptions of being paid a compliment. It's like you with your amazing shoes. Like people
Right.
just really love it. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
They just fit.
um,
They look great.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. I think you should add like the link to them in the show notes,
Yeah,
definitely.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, like people just really love it. Like small compliments, big compliments, whatever. We just really enjoy hearing that we're appreciated. And paying compliments really helps. It helps the person expressing the compliment as well as the person receiving. There's a great study looking at kids giving university students giving presentations in a kind of um, uh, like competition that was kind of based around Shark Tank, the TV show. They found that like when they were working in groups, if one person expressed gratitude to the other person, uh, both of those people showed a kind of more muted stress response to the kind of challenge of presenting their product or idea to the judges. So we should all. I think that's really good evidence that in general, we're pretty good at paying compliments or expressing gratitude, and we should do it uh, more often. But again, there's like we can do it better still. Like we might be good, but we can improve. And one of the things that you kind of hinted at in your question is that uh, we often don't fully recognize the person when we're complimenting them or expressing appreciation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So something, like comparing someone to like saying, "Oh, you look like this kind of celebrity" or whatever, like that. It's kind of it can be flattering, but like if it's not really authentic and they don't really look like that person, like it's not really that flattering actually. It's just
Right. Right.
that is when your compliments feel kind of staged and a bit tired. So make sure that they're totally authentic with something that you really believe. And especially when you're, thanking someone for help that they've given you, for something that has improved your life. Like, don't just talk about the effects of the action, but talk about the qualities, the personal qualities that kind of contributed to it. So if someone, you're having like IT problems like at work, and someone helps you with your computer, uh, like say retrieving like lost documents or whatever, like it's totally fine to say like, oh, thanks, that saved me so much trouble, but you're really focusing there on the service, not the person. And it's much better to say like, oh, you're a genius, like your expertise and generosity has just like been so helpful to me. Like that is what I really appreciate, like that you were using your skills to help me in this kind of incredibly generous way. It's a small difference, but those are the kinds of uh, kind of words of appreciation that really do seem to foster connection.
Well, it helps the other person to not only appreciate what you did and how it affected you, but it also reinforces what it is about them, whether it's a habit, a skill,
Mm,
an ability, or a quality that they have that they can then carry with them. And I love how you
right.
broke that down. There's such a positive aspect to that piece. Speaking of positive, I want to thank you for introducing me to this concept of, this is another word, I'm not sure if I'm going to say it right, confelicity. Is that right?
Yeah,
So, um, different than compassion, right? What is
right.
confelicity and how does it compare to compassion?
Yeah, I mean, so compassion, like the origins of that term is it's kind of feeling another's suffering. Um,
Mm.
that's the idea of where it comes from. Incidentally, I mean, compassion is great. Like, I mean, it really is important for building connection, and more compassionate people actually have better personal well-being because they do have better relationships. I'm not knocking compassion, But
Right. Right.
we do tend to kind of focus on that. It's great to show empathy for people, to help them when they need support. Like all of that is fantastic. But confelicity is just saying that we can also feel empathy for people who are going through really good events in their life.
Yeah.
Like you can feel vicarious joy for someone who has achieved that personal best at the gym, or who's just got married, or who, has won a professional award. You know, that is confelicity, is feeling that joy for another person's happiness. It's also called Mitfreude, which is
Okay.
kind of the opposite of Schadenfreude. So Mitfreude is when you're kind of feeling joy with another person rather than feeling joy at their misfortune. Um, so Mitfreude, confelicity, however you want to label this, is just a neglected emotion that can enhance connection. And it should change the way that we talk about our own uh, kind of positive experiences, because often we hide our success. We, like we don't want to seem like we're bragging. So we just don't mention the things that are making us happy and that we're proud of. And, you know, we think we're going to avoid envy, but actually, that is often quite insulting to the people around us. It's as if it actually shows a kind of lack of respect to them. It's as if you don't trust that they're going to respond well and that you kind of think they're quite a petty person. So it's actually very insulting when you hide your success. And what we need is more trust that rather than feeling envy, people are going to feel this confelicity or Mitfreude, that they're going to have that happiness for us. And the research suggests, it's much more likely than we would predict. And that when you do that, um, your well-being and the other person's well-being increases because of that connection that you've created.
It's such a satisfying feeling, isn't it? This is a concept. I don't know who introduced me to it, but it's something that I've really focused on for the last at least couple of decades. And it literally is at a point now where, like, when I saw this cover pop up on your social media, and I shot you a message saying, "Wow, congratulations! That's so exciting." I can't remember what I said, but my heart was just oozing pride.
Yeah.
I had a huge smile on my face, thinking, I can imagine David has worked so hard on this book, because knowing what your writing looks like after having read your other books, I can just imagine what you went through to research to pull it together. I mean, everything from cover design to the title to editing. I mean, what a process. And I felt so much pride in looking at this and thinking, hey, I, this is amazing. Like, what an amazing feeling he's got to have. I walked around with a smile on my face all day, just knowing that you had accomplished this. It was such a cool feeling. And that feeling of confelicity is something that I want more of in life. I am now actively searching it out in life. I can't say that 20 plus years ago I was doing that. Maybe because of shyness or wanting to accomplish my own things, right? But I almost feel like I get more satisfaction off of it, sharing in other people's excitement than I do in my own. Which I don't know if that's healthy or not, but
Yeah.
that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, no, I think it's really helping. Yeah, I mean, so thanks first of all for like all the kind of things you said. But yeah, it is like you say, like you can feel like your heart is bursting with your happiness for another person. And sometimes I think like it can, like you say, it can actually be more satisfying to see someone else's happiness. Because I think when we feel kind of happiness at our own achievements, like often it can be tempered a little by like a kind of fear of failure following that,
Mm,
or kind
yeah,
of embarrassment, like
yeah.
it can be complex. There's a great essay by Zadie Smith on joy, where she describes it as feeling quite a precarious emotion. But
Mm,
when you're just feeling happy for someone else, like
mm.
you can really bask in their happiness and enjoy it. And that really means a lot to that other person, like knowing that you feel like that. Knowing that that someone's experiencing that confelicity, it really is one of the best ways of exhibiting that shared reality.
Yeah, it's a great feeling. It's something I am it's a drug I am actively seeking on a regular basis. And so I appreciate you introducing that in the book and mapping that out a little bit more. Well, David, I know we're coming up on our time, and I want to thank you so much for coming on today and talking about the book. One of the things that as I mentioned before, that I find fascinating about your work is that you are a writer who does a significant amount of research, and then you also research it by testing these things on yourself. If you were to look back at the process of writing the laws of connection, and you were to say, okay, this is how I have grown, this is how I have evolved through the process of creating and crafting this book, how would you describe that evolutionary process?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so, I mentioned that I was kind of shy, uh, kind of in my teens and 20s, and I kind of carried that shyness with me, kind of into my 30s, even if it was kind of to a lesser extent. I think writing this book, um, like reading that research and then writing about it is like a great way of kind of internalizing the findings. So, yeah, I do feel a lot more confident now in those social interactions. I feel a lot more uh like yeah, kind of secure, I guess, in knowing
Mhm.
that like social support is there around me. And one of the unexpected side effects of that, I think, is that I guess in the past I'd had some kind of social connections, like uh, with like family members and friends, that were maybe like less than ideal in that they were, sometimes maybe a little bit toxic. And so it's a maybe a surprising side effect of this process is that actually with some of those people I've been able to change the interactions and we get on better. With others, I've actually felt confident enough to kind of establish more distance as well, because I think understanding just all of the possibilities for social connection there are around you, it does mean that you can realize if a relationship isn't functioning, then maybe, and you don't think the problem is with you, you think it's with the other person, like you can feel confident enough to create the distance that you need from that person.
I love that. I mean, the connections come and go. We sometimes connect and then reconnect. Sometimes we disconnect and then
Right.
reconnect, and sometimes we just disconnect and move on, and we have other connections in life. What a beautiful way to put it. The book is The Laws of Connection: The Scientific Secrets of Building a Strong Social Network. The author is David Robson. David, the book comes out the week that we are releasing this episode. I'm sure people can find it anywhere and everywhere, correct?
Right, yeah. Anyway, you buy your books normally, you can get a copy of The Laws of Connection. I do include a few links to kind of to Amazon, but also to like indie bookshops, like just a few possibilities that you could use on. They're all on my website, davidrobson.me. But yeah, it should be available everywhere.
You also write for some other publications. You publish your own work, your articles here and there. So if anyone is not following David on social media, if you're not on David's website, I would highly recommend it. And that is, give the website again. I apologize.
Davidrobson.me.
Thank you. That was my inattention as I was looking back down at the book and the cover. Well, David Robson, once again, thank you for coming on. What an honor to have you, and what a wonderful book. I'm going back through it now a second time to pull out more information that I can start to apply in my life. But so thank you for the time, the work, and the effort that you put into it, and thank you for the conversation today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of The Evolved Man. If you're learning from and gaining value from this podcast, please subscribe to the Evolved Man newsletter, where I can support you even more in your personal evolution. I want to help you reverse engineer your success. The Evolved Man newsletter is like getting a free coaching session to keep you moving forward on your path of personal success. Go to theevolvedmanpodcast.com to sign up today. If you found value in this episode, you can give us up to a 5-star rating on Apple and Spotify and share it with your network. That's the best way to support the podcast so we can continue to get great guests and provide you with the best wisdom for your daily life. Until next time, keep evolving.